There's actually a Steve Jobs story that I teach when I'm teaching one of these techniques that's called using standards. And the psychology behind it is that people are influenced by their own standards. So if you can find out what someone else's standards or ideals for themselves and their identity and their behavior are, then if there's a gap, there's huge cognitive dissonance that kicks in where they have to either change their belief or they have to change their behavior, right? And Steve Jobs, there's this a video that you can find online where John Sculley is being interviewed on TV about how Steve Jobs recruited him to Apple. Sculley is saying how when Steve Jobs is trying to recruit him, it's hard for me to even imagine back in the 80s when Apple's this 4-year-old computer company started in a garage. John Sculley's the CEO of Pepsi. It's a $1 billion company. He's the boss man, and upstart Steve Jobs is like, hey, dude, you should come and run my little thing, right? So John Sculley says no, John Sculley says no again. And then as he describes it, Steve Jobs comes back and he asks him a third time, and he says, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, John? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? And what John Sculley says is, he goes, I gulped, and I knew I was going to wonder for the rest of my life what would have happened if I said no. John Sculley is a leader who's motivated by the good that he can do. And when Steve Jobs puts this label on it, labels are super powerful when they're true. And the label that he puts on Sculley's job of selling sugar water is totally true. That's what Sculley is doing, with the flourish of for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
When Steve Jobs did that to John Sculley, he poisoned John Sculley's job forever.
Right.
And that's one of the many, many examples of what you said. He got people to do great things, but at the cost of hating themselves.
Yeah.
So this is presented as this inspirational pitch of like, come with me and change the world. But he was really twisting the knife in Sculley's gut and saying, you have to come with me or hate yourself forever.
If you could rewrite that conversation and have Jobs still get Sculley to come over, but not in a way that makes him hate himself, how would you teach a student to have that conversation? What would you say instead to bring them over?
Well, that's presupposing that Sculley should come over, and that's actually where Steve Jobs and I diverge. Mm-hmm. The whole problem with that scenario to me is that he was coming back in this high pressure pitch after John Sculley, who should be the master of himself, has said no, and he has said no again. And it's not that there's anything wrong with asking after somebody says no, right? Mm-hmm. But there's something wrong with pressuring someone after they've said no.
Maybe the answer then would have been that Jobs ought to have not been asking Sculley, but asking a different CEO whose core value is aligned better with Jobs.
Yeah, and we don't actually know that Sculley was instrumental in the world changing, because Steve Jobs is the guy who went down in history with all of the glory about it.